My husband forgot my birthday but gave my mother-in-law a car, so I cut him off and his reaction was shocking. I still remember the evening Daniel first mentioned his dream. We were sitting on the threadbare couch in our tiny apartment, sharing a bottle of cheap wine to celebrate our second anniversary. Rain pattered against the windows, creating a cozy soundtrack to our whispered plans for the future. His eyes sparkled in the dim light when he said it, almost shyly. I want to open a cafe. It wasn't a casual statement. It was a confession. As if he'd been carrying this dream close to his chest for years, afraid to let it breathe in the open air where practical concerns might smother it. And in that moment, seeing his vulnerability, I fell in love with him all over again. Tell me more, I encouraged, tucking my feet under his thigh, settling in for what I knew would be a passionate description. Daniel had always been a talented baker. His mother, Elaine, had taught him the basics, but he had an intuitive sense about flavors that transcended her traditional recipes. Every Sunday morning, he'd fill our cramped kitchen with the aromas of cinnamon, vanilla, and freshly baked bread. Friends would coincidentally drop by, lured by the promise of his experimental creations. I want to call it Crumb and Kettle, he continued, his voice gaining confidence. A place where people don't just come for coffee and pastries, but for connection.
Community.
Real conversations over real food. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself nodding along, mentally rearranging furniture in non-existent spaces, picturing warm lighting and the satisfied faces of customers. That sounds perfect, I said, meaning it. What I didn't say was what we both knew. Daniel had been laid off from his accounting job 3 months ago and had been struggling to find stable employment since. We were barely making rent. His credit was shot from student loans, and his family, particularly his father, had made it clear that entrepreneurship was a fool's game. Get a real job, his father had barked the last time Daniel had even hinted at wanting to work for himself. Later that night, as Daniel slept, I slipped out of bed and opened my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I had $78,000 in an inheritance account from my grandmother, money I'd been saving for someday. As I stared at the balance, I realized that someday had arrived, just not in the form I'd expected. It wasn't going to be a down payment on a house or a safety net for children we might have. It was going to be an investment in the man I loved and the dream that made his eyes light up like nothing else could. The next morning, over coffee, I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about his cafe idea. I believe in you, I said simply, and I want to invest in your dream. Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. With what? We're barely getting by. I explained about the inheritance, downplaying the amount slightly. His initial reaction was resistance, pride keeping him from accepting such help. But I was persistent. This isn't charity, I insisted. It's an investment. We'll be partners. Partners, he repeated, testing the word. The idea seemed to come for him, easing the blow to his masculine pride. Equals. Absolutely. I agreed, already picturing our names side by side on business cards. Daniel and Emma Harris, co-owners of Crumb and Kettle. That conversation kicked off 6 months of intense preparation. We scouted locations, wrote and rewrote business plans, and attended small business workshops together. I learned about espresso machines while Daniel perfected his signature pastries. We spent evenings debating color schemes and mornings visiting potential suppliers. When we found the perfect location, a corner space with large windows and good foot traffic in an up-and-coming neighborhood, I handled the negotiations with the landlord. What Daniel didn't know was that the landlord, Mr. Winters, was actually my godfather. I'd reached out to him privately, and while he didn't give us a discount, he was too ethical for that, he did agree to more favorable terms on the lease. The day we signed the papers, Daniel was so nervous he could barely hold the pen. I squeezed his hand under the table, our secret signal of support. "You've got this," I whispered. What he didn't see was the separate document I signed afterward, a guarantor agreement making me personally responsible if the business defaulted. Mr. Winters had insisted on it, not because he doubted Daniel, but because he wanted to protect me. "Make sure your name is on everything, Emma," he advised when Daniel stepped out to take a call. "Joint accounts, shared ownership, everything." I've seen too many women get pushed aside in business partnerships, even with their husbands. I brushed off his concern with a laugh. Daniel's not like that. We're a team. Mr. Winters just patted my hand with a sad smile that I would later recognize as foresight. The weeks before opening were a blur of activity. I quietly paid for the top-of-the-line espresso machine when our initial budget couldn't stretch that far. I negotiated with suppliers, getting better terms by leveraging connections from my former job in corporate sales. I stayed up late designing our logo while Daniel perfected his recipes. When we couldn't afford a professional contractor for renovations, I called in favors from friends in the trades, organizing weekend work parties that transformed the space. Through it all, Daniel's confidence grew. Each problem solved, each hurdle cleared, added to his sense that this dream was actually attainable. The anxiety that had plagued him since his layoff began to fade, replaced by a focused determination I found irresistibly attractive. On opening day, as I stood beside him at the counter, watching him greet our first customers with the ease of someone born for this role, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what partnership looked like. Supporting each other's dreams, making them possible through combined effort. I believed in him when no one else did, and watching him shine, I couldn't have been prouder. What I couldn't see then was how quickly the spotlight I'd helped create would become a stage for one, not two. How easily our dream would become his achievement. How completely I could disappear from the narrative of success I had helped to write. 6 months after opening day, Crumb and Kettle was no longer just a cafe. It was becoming a phenomenon. What started as a trickle of curious locals had swelled into lines that sometimes stretched down the block, especially on weekend mornings. Daniel's experimental pastries had developed a cult following, with food bloggers making special trips across town to photograph his sunrise soufflé and midnight mocha twists. I felt a surge of pride watching it all unfold. Our gamble, my investment, was paying off beyond our wildest expectations. The first time I noticed something was off came during a feature in a local magazine. The reporter had spent hours in the cafe, observing operations and interviewing Daniel. When the article came out, it was titled "The One-Man Wonder Behind Crumb and Kettle." For pages of glossy photos and glowing prose about Daniel's solo journey from unemployment to entrepreneurial success. Not a single mention of me, not even as his wife. They must have misunderstood, Daniel said when I pointed it out, barely glancing up from the scheduling spreadsheet he was working on. Next interview, I'll make it clearer. But the pattern continued. A radio spot where the host introduced him as the mastermind and sole proprietor. A feature on a popular food blog that described his brave leap into business ownership with nothing but determination. A local business award that listed him as the only owner. Each time, I swallowed my disappointment and reminded myself that it didn't matter who got the credit. We knew the truth. We were partners. Except it seemed one of us was forgetting that fact. Daniel, did you tell the Chamber of Commerce I'm your co-owner for the networking event next week? I asked one evening as we closed up. He hesitated, wiping down the espresso machine with uncharacteristic focus. Well, it's just that the invitation was for business owners and their spouses. So, technically, you'd be coming as my wife. But I am a business owner, I said, my voice calm despite the tightening in my chest. This is our cafe. Daniel sighed, putting down the cloth. Emma, you know I appreciate everything you've done. But when it comes to the day-to-day operations and decision-making, that's all me. You helped with the initial investment, sure, but nothing. I cut in, stung by the dismissal. I negotiated the lease. I designed the interior. I created our entire supply chain and hiring process. I still do the books every month. He had the grace to look momentarily abashed, but it quickly shifted to a placating smile. And you're amazing at all of that. You're my rock, and I couldn't do this without your support. Support, not partnership. The distinction cut deep. As the cafe's reputation grew, so did Daniel's absence from our home life. Early mornings bled into late nights as he pursued every opportunity to expand the business's reach. A catering side hustle. A wholesale arrangement with 3 local grocery stores. A weekend stall at the farmer's market. We're building something special here, He'd say whenever I mentioned the toll on our relationship, "Don't you want us to succeed?" Us. The word felt hollow now. I still showed up every day, handling the background operations that kept everything running smoothly. I managed inventory, processed payroll, and trained new hires. I created marketing materials and maintained our social media presence, always careful to center Daniel in every post as he preferred. Then came the profiles in city magazines and feature spots on local news. Daniel Harris, self-made cafe owner. The captions would read. In interviews, he'd tell the story of our beginning, only it had transformed. Now he was the one who found the location. He was the one who negotiated with suppliers. He was the one who took the massive financial risk. I became a footnote in our own story. My wife, Emma, he'd say in passing, usually followed by some variation of "she's been so supportive." Friends started asking if I'd quit working at the cafe. "Daniel never mentions you when he talks about the business," one said, confused. Family members would congratulate him at gatherings while I stood by, invisible. Even our employees began treating me more like the boss's wife than their employer. The final evidence of my erasure came on a Tuesday. I'd stopped by the cafe after running errands, planning to help with the afternoon rush. As I approached the front door, I noticed a new sign had been installed, a sleek metal plaque that read "Crumb and Kettle, established by Daniel Harris, 2022. I stood there, keys in hand, staring at the proclamation of my non-existence. That evening, I mentioned it to Daniel. His response was a distracted "Does it matter? Everyone knows you're my wife." Wife. Not partner. Not co-founder. Not co-owner. I began to understand that in his mind, these distinctions weren't the same betrayal they were to me. He genuinely didn't see how he was rewriting our history. Or perhaps he simply preferred the revised version, where his success was entirely self-made. The day everything changed was a crisp autumn morning, October 15th, my birthday. Daniel had left before dawn, as usual, with no mention of the date's significance. I told myself he was planning a surprise for later and went about my day, waiting for the text or call that never came. By late afternoon, I decided to stop by the cafe. Perhaps he'd been too busy to reach out and was planning to surprise me there instead. The scene I walked into would be forever seared into my memory. The cafe was closed to customers. A small crowd of staff and friends had gathered in a circle near the front counter. In the center stood Daniel, beaming with pride, his arm around his mother, Elaine. And parked just outside the window, adorned with an enormous red bow, was a gleaming silver Mercedes. "I couldn't have done any of this without your belief in me, Mom," Daniel was saying, holding out a set of car keys. "When no one else thought I could make it in business, you stood by me. This is just a small token of my appreciation." Elaine gasped, tears filling her eyes. "Oh, Daniel, a car? This is too much." "Nothing's too much for the person who made all this possible," he replied, gesturing around at the cafe, our cafe. I stood frozen in the doorway, invisible to the celebrating crowd. The irony was almost too perfect, a luxury car for his mother's faith, while my very existence in the business had been systematically erased. And on my birthday, a day he hadn't acknowledged with so much as a text message, someone finally noticed me and nudged Daniel. He turned, his face lighting up with automatic welcome before registering my expression. "Emma, come join us." Mom's speechless about her surprise. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not with a dramatic crack or shatter, but with the quiet finality of a switch being flipped. The woman who had believed in him, who had sacrificed for his dream, who had tolerated being made invisible, she disappeared completely. In her place stood someone new. Someone with very different plans. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned and walked away, Daniel's confused calls fading behind me as the door swung shut. The business took off, and suddenly, I became invisible. But invisibility, I was about to discover, had its advantages. The house was dark when Daniel finally came home that night. He found me sitting in the kitchen, a single candle flickering on the island counter, the tiny flame illuminating a cupcake with a lone, unlit candle. Recognition flashed across his face, followed quickly by horror. "Emma, I raised my hand, stopping his words. Then I blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and walked upstairs without a word. That was the beginning of my silence. The next morning, when Daniel tried to apologize with grand gestures, flowers delivered hourly, a hastily purchased bracelet left on my pillow, promises of weekend getaways, I accepted each offering with a polite smile that never reached my eyes and a nod that conveyed nothing. No anger, no forgiveness, just nothing. "Please talk to me," he pleaded on the third day. "Yell at me if you want. Tell me what I need to do to fix this." I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since that fateful day at the cafe. The successful businessman who had once been my equal partner stood before me, genuinely bewildered by my reaction. He expected tears, accusations, maybe a door-slamming fight that would clear the air and reset our relationship. The predictable cycle of transgression, penance, and forgiveness that had become our pattern. But I was done playing that role. "There's nothing to say," I replied, my voice calm. Then I returned to the book I was reading, dismissing him as easily as he had dismissed my contributions to our shared success. My new approach extended beyond our home. I stopped showing up at the cafe for my regular shifts. The books remained unbalanced, the inventory unchecked, the schedules unmade. When the head barista called in a panic about a missing delivery, I listened sympathetically and suggested she ask Daniel. When our accountant emailed about discrepancies in the quarterly statements, I politely directed him to the owner. "I'm just the wife," I wrote. Daniel noticed, of course. How could he not? The well-oiled machine that was crumb and kettle began to sputter. "The cafe needs you," he said over dinner one evening, trying a new tactic. "The staff keeps asking where you've been." "I'm sure you'll manage," I replied, serene in my detachment. "After all, you built this business from nothing, right? That's what the sign says." A flash of guilt crossed his face, quickly replaced by frustration. "Is that what this is about? A sign? I can change the sign, Emma." I just smiled and excused myself from the table, leaving my meal half-eaten. The silence became my armor, my weapon, my strategy. I moved through our shared life like a ghost, present but not participating. I slept beside him, but built a fortress of pillows between us. I sat across from him at meals, but kept my gaze on my plate. I nodded at his stories, but offered none of my own. My phone stopped lighting up with texts from cafe suppliers asking for my input. My email inbox, once flooded with business correspondence, grew quiet as word spread that I was no longer involved in operations. Even Daniel's mother, Elaine, seemed to sense the shift, her eager calls about her new car tapering off when my responses became monosyllabic. "You're punishing me," Daniel accused 2 weeks into my silent campaign. "This is emotional manipulation." I considered his words, then shrugged. "I'm adapting to my role as defined by you. I'm being supportive," silently. Those were the most words I'd strung together for him in days, and they landed like precision strikes. He paled, then flushed with anger. "That's not fair. I've always valued your input. But not your partnership," I finished for him, my voice still unnervingly calm. "There's a difference." After that exchange, Daniel redoubled his efforts to bring me back into the fold. He started bringing home paperwork from the cafe, casually asking for my opinion on new vendors or menu items. He mentioned issues with the point-of-sale system, problems that he knew I could solve in minutes. He even suggested I come in for a casual visit to boost staff morale. Each time, I listened politely, then declined to engage. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," became my mantra. My silence extended to our social circle. At a dinner party with friends, someone asked about the cafe's recent feature in a national food magazine. "Daniel can tell you all about it," I said with a pleasant smile. "It's his accomplishment." The emphasis was subtle, but unmistakable. Confusion flickered across our friends' faces as Daniel launched into the story, conspicuously inserting "we" and "our" at every opportunity, throwing nervous glances my way. Too little, too late. At night, when he slept, I would sometimes study his face in the dim light filtering through our curtains. The boy I had fallen in love with was still there, somewhere beneath the veneer of the successful businessman who had forgotten his roots. I didn't hate him. That would have required energy I wasn't willing to expend. Instead, I felt a curious detachment, as if I were observing a stranger who happened to share my home. 1 month into my silent rebellion, Daniel reached for me in bed. The gesture was desperate, a man drowning, grasping for a lifeline. "I miss you," he whispered into the darkness. "I miss us." I didn't pull away, but I didn't respond either. I lay there, letting him hold my unresponsive hand until he gave up and rolled away, his breathing uneven with unshed tears. In the morning, his eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped with defeat. He poured coffee into his travel mug with mechanical movements, preparing for another day at the cafe that was slowly unraveling without my invisible support system. "Will you be home for dinner?" he asked, a question that had once been routine but now carried the weight of deeper inquiry. "Will you be present? Will you speak to me? Will you come back from wherever you've gone?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'll be here. Present, but not participating. Visible, but not engaged. A ghost in my own marriage, just as I had become a ghost in my own business." He nodded, accepting my literal answer while missing my metaphorical truth. As the front door closed behind him, I felt a strange sense of power. Not the destructive power of confrontation, but the quiet strength of withdrawal. Daniel thought I was sulking, a temporary emotional response that would eventually run its course. He had no idea that my silence wasn't the end of my strategy, but merely its beginning. No idea that while he struggled to keep his cafe afloat with his limited understanding of its operations, I was systematically preparing for the next phase of my plan. Because if he wanted to act like I didn't matter, I was about to show him just how much I did. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning. I woke before dawn, dressed in my most professional outfit, a charcoal pantsuit I hadn't worn since my corporate days, and drove to First National Bank. The early hour ensured Daniel would still be asleep, oblivious to my departure and my purpose. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," the bank manager greeted me, ushering me into his office with a warm smile. "What brings you in so early today?" "I need to make some changes to my business accounts," I replied, placing a folder of documents on his desk. "Specifically, I'd like my name removed from the Crumb and Kettle business account." His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a significant change. Is everything all right with the cafe? The business seems to be thriving." "The business is fine," I assured him. "But my involvement has evolved. I'm pursuing other opportunities." He nodded, professional enough not to pry further. As he processed the paperwork, I felt a strange lightness. No guilt, no second thoughts, just the clear-eyed certainty that I was correcting a long-standing imbalance. By 9 o'clock, I was no longer financially tied to Crumb and Kettle. The business account that had held my inheritance, that had been built on my investment, would continue, but without my name as a safeguard, without my creditworthiness as a foundation. Next, I drove to the office of Riverton Supply Company, our primary vendor for specialty ingredients. Maria, the account manager who had become a friend over the years of my careful negotiations, greeted me with confusion. "Emma, we weren't expecting you. Is there an issue with yesterday's delivery?" "No issue," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "But I do need to discuss our contract." Maria's expression shifted to concern as I explained that I would no longer be serving as the guarantor for Crumb and Kettle's accounts. The 60-day payment terms I had personally negotiated, terms based on my previous business relationships and personal guarantee, would need to be reconsidered. "Daniel will need to establish his own payment arrangements moving forward," I explained, my voice steady. "I've drafted a transition letter that gives 30 days' notice, per our agreement." "This is unexpected," Maria said carefully. "Those generous terms were only offered because of your history with us. The standard for new accounts is payment upfront, especially in the food industry." "I understand," I replied, "and I appreciate your flexibility during the transition." One by one, I visited or called every vendor and service provider whose favorable terms had been secured through my personal connections or guarantees. the premium coffee supplier who offered us wholesale prices because of my friendship with the owner's daughter, the equipment maintenance company that prioritized our repairs because I had once helped the manager secure a loan, the marketing firm that gave us discounted rates because I had brought them 3 other clients. With each conversation, I was polite but firm. I wasn't angry or vengeful. I was simply removing myself from equations where I had been rendered invisible. By mid-afternoon, I had dismantled much of the invisible infrastructure that kept Crumb and Kettle running smoothly. The foundation Daniel took for granted was quietly crumbling beneath his feet, though he wouldn't feel the tremors for days or even weeks. My final stop was the most difficult, but also the most necessary. I parked outside the Weather Victorian that housed my godfather's property management company, gathering my courage before walking inside. Mr. Winters' eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure when he saw me. "Emma, what a wonderful surprise. How's that husband of yours doing with the cafe?" The question was innocent, but it stung nonetheless. Not "how are you doing with the cafe," but "how is Daniel doing?" as if the business belonged solely to him, just as Daniel had been claiming. "That's actually why I'm here," I said, settling into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. "I need to discuss the lease for Crumb and Kettle." Mr. Winters' smile faded as I explained my decision to withdraw as guarantor. The lease had always been in both our names, but my personal relationship with Mr. Winters had been the true security. Without my backing, the terms would need to be renegotiated, likely with a substantial security deposit that Daniel didn't know we'd been exempted from. "Are you sure about this, Emma?" Mr. Winters asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "This could seriously impact the business." "I'm sure," I replied quietly. "It's time for Daniel to understand exactly what I've contributed all these years." My godfather studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I warned you once, didn't I? About making sure your name was on everything." "You did," I acknowledged. "I should have listened more carefully." "It's never too late to take back your power," he said, patting my hand before reaching for the lease documents. As I drove home in the fading afternoon light, I felt neither triumph nor remorse. Just a calm certainty that I was finally valuing myself as I should have all along. Daniel was already home when I arrived, pacing the kitchen with frantic energy. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I've been calling you all day. We've got a situation at the cafe." I set my keys down carefully. "What kind of situation?" "Our coffee supplier called. They're changing our payment terms effective immediately, demanding payment up front before they'll deliver our next order. They said our account status has changed." What does that even mean? So it had begun. Faster than I'd anticipated. I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds challenging." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "It's insane. We've worked with them for years without a single late payment. And they're not the only ones. The equipment repair company called too. They can't fit us into their schedule for the broken refrigerator until next week now, claiming we're no longer on their priority client list." "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said, echoing the dismissive phrase he'd used so often when I'd tried to discuss business matters with him. He barely registered my response, too caught up in his growing panic. And to top it all off, the bank called about some change to our account authorization. "I have to go in tomorrow to sort it out." I moved around the kitchen, calmly preparing a cup of tea while Daniel's world began to fracture. In his distress, he didn't notice my lack of surprise, my absence of helpful suggestions. For years, I had been the problem solver, the fixer, the behind-the-scenes supporter who made everything run smoothly. Now I was simply absent. Over the next 2 weeks, the carefully constructed facade of Daniel's self-made success began to crumble in earnest. Deliveries were delayed when he couldn't meet the new payment terms. Staff became restless as the schedule grew chaotic without my organizational skills. Regular customers noticed the declining quality as Daniel scrambled to source inferior ingredients at prices he could manage. Each day brought a new crisis, a new revelation of just how dependent the cafe had been on my invisible contributions. And each day, I observed his mounting panic with detached interest, offering neither assistance nor explanation. I pulled out, quietly,
strategically,
and watched as the empire he had claimed as his alone revealed its true foundations. 3 weeks after I began my strategic withdrawal, the inevitable confrontation arrived with the force of a hurricane. I was in our home office, reviewing potential locations for a business idea that had been quietly taking shape in my mind, when the front door slammed with such violence that picture frames rattled on the walls. Heavy footsteps thundered through the house, a furious cadence that crescendoed as Daniel burst into the room. Gone was the polished cafe owner who charmed food critics and chatted effortlessly with customers. In his place stood a man unraveling at the seams, hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled and stained with coffee, eyes wild with a volatile mix of panic and rage. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice scraping like gravel. I closed my laptop calmly, folding my hands atop it. "You'll need to be more specific." "Don't play innocent." He slammed a stack of papers onto the desk between us. "Bank statements, vendor notices, a letter from our landlord, my godfather, outlining new lease terms. Everything is falling apart. Everything. And it all leads back to you." I studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the strained lines around his mouth that hadn't been there a month ago. For a fleeting moment, I felt a twinge of sympathy, the echo of the love that had once made me invest everything in his dream. But the moment passed quickly, washed away by the memory of standing unacknowledged while he gifted my money to his mother. I removed my name from our business accounts. I confirmed my voice level, as well as my personal guarantees from our vendor contracts and lease. The color drained from his face. "You what?" "Why would you? How could you?" He struggled to form a coherent question, outrage tangling his words. "You forgot my birthday, Daniel." He blinked rapidly, momentarily derailed by what must have seemed like a non sequitur. This catastrophe is about your birthday? Are you insane?" "No," I said, rising from my chair to face him squarely. "You forgot my birthday, Daniel. But you remembered to thank your mother with a car I indirectly paid for." The words landed like precise incisions, cutting through his bluster. I watched understanding dawn in his eyes, followed immediately by defensive anger. "That's completely different. The car was a business expense, a thank you to my biggest supporter. You're being petty and vindictive over a forgotten date on a calendar." I laughed then, a sound so genuine in its disbelief that it startled us both. "Your biggest supporter?" I echoed. "Let's discuss who really supported this business, Daniel." With methodical calm, I opened a filing cabinet and removed a folder, documents I'd gathered in preparation for this very conversation. One by one, I laid them on the desk between us. The original cafe funding from my inheritance account, the lease listing me as primary guarantor, the vendor contracts secured through my personal and professional relationships, the loan approvals based on my credit history. "This cafe exists because of me," I said plainly. "Not just my emotional support or my belief in you, though I gave those freely as well. My money, my connections, my credit, my reputation. The only thing that wasn't mine was the recognition. You kept that entirely for yourself." Daniel stared at the paper trail of his dependents, his face cycling through emotions, disbelief, shame, fear, and finally, desperate negotiation. I never meant to take you for granted, Emma," he stammered, his tone shifting to placating. "You know how much I value everything you've done. We can fix this. I'll add your name to the sign, announce our partnership publicly, whatever you want." "What I want," I replied, "is for you to understand what you've lost. Not just a silent partner or a convenient bankroll, but a woman who believed in you when no one else did. Who invested her inheritance in your dream without demanding credit. Who built the systems that made your cafe successful, only to be erased from the narrative." His face crumpled as the full magnitude of his actions and their consequences finally registered. "The business is collapsing, Emma. Suppliers are demanding payment upfront. The bank froze our expansion loan. Mr. Winters is requiring a security deposit we can't afford. Staff are quitting because the schedule is chaos without you." His voice broke. "I can't do this without you." "No," I agreed softly. "You can't. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of truth finally acknowledged. Daniel sank into a chair, the fight draining from him as quickly as it had erupted. "I never meant for this to happen," he whispered, staring at his hands. "When did I become this person? This fraud who takes credit for others' work?" It was the first honest question he'd asked in months, maybe years. Not a defense or a deflection, but a genuine moment of self-reflection. "It happened gradually," I said, offering neither condemnation nor absolution. Success can be intoxicating. The story of the self-made man is more appealing than the reality of partnership. I was so focused on proving myself to my father, to everyone who doubted me. He looked up, his eyes rimmed with tears. "I was trying to be worthy of your investment, and somehow ended up betraying it entirely." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "Can we fix this?" he asked, vulnerability replacing his earlier rage. "The business, our marriage, is it too late?" I considered his question carefully. The wounded pride that had fueled my withdrawal had evolved into something more significant, a clear-eyed recognition of my own worth and a refusal to accept anything less than full acknowledgement. "The business might be salvageable," I said finally, "but only with complete transparency about its true ownership and history." Hope flickered in his eyes. "And us?" I met his gaze steadily. "That's a separate question, Daniel. You didn't just forget my birthday or fail to give me credit for the cafe. You systematically erased me from a narrative we created together. You turned me into a ghost in my own life." His face turned pale as the reality of what he'd done and what he stood to lose fully registered. That's when the crying started, not the strategic tears of manipulation I'd seen him use in arguments before, but the raw, ugly sobbing of genuine remorse. "I'm not a businessman without you," he choked out between breaths. "I'm not anything without you." The admission should have felt like victory. Instead, it merely confirmed what I had already decided. A partnership based on such fundamental inequality could never be truly restored. I watched him cry, neither moving to comfort him, nor taking pleasure in his pain. In that moment, I realized the final truth of our unraveling. He had needed me far more than I had ever needed him. And that recognition, more than any act of revenge, was the true liberation. The separation papers arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier to the apartment where Daniel had been staying for the past 3 weeks. I imagined him opening the crisp manila envelope, the weight of finality sinking in as he reviewed the documents outlining our disentanglement, financial, legal, and emotional. I didn't wait for his response. I had given enough of my time to anticipation of Daniel's reactions, to the careful management of his feelings. Now, my focus was entirely on rebuilding my life on my terms. The first step was letting go of Crumb and Kettle. I could have fought for it. Legally, the business was as much mine as his, but I no longer wanted something that carried the taint of erasure. Better to start fresh than constantly repair what had been deliberately broken. "You're walking away from your investment," my lawyer cautioned when I declined to pursue my rightful claim to the cafe. "After everything you've put into that business, are you sure this is what you want?" "I'm not walking away from anything," I corrected her. "I'm walking towards something better." That something better began to take shape in an abandoned floral shop 6 blocks from Crumb and Kettle. The space was smaller, with weathered wooden floors and tall windows that flooded the interior with natural light. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a resonance, a sense of possibility that had nothing to do with Daniel or his dreams. My dream had been forming in the quiet weeks of my strategic withdrawal. Not a cafe, but a bakery specializing in heritage recipes from around the world. The kind of baking that told stories through flavors, that preserved cultural traditions while creating new ones. I named it Emma's Inheritance, a double meaning that made me smile each time I said it aloud. My grandmother's money had funded Daniel's cafe. Now it would fund my own vision. But the true inheritance I was claiming ran deeper than finances. It was the courage to stand alone, to build something that bore my name and my name only. Word of the separation spread quickly through our social circle. Daniel's attempts to salvage Crumb and Kettle without my support became increasingly desperate. He tried to secure loans to meet the new lease terms, but found his credit history insufficient without my backing. He approached investors, but they balked when they discovered the true ownership history he'd concealed. He's considering selling, a mutual friend informed me during a chance encounter at the farmer's market. There's a restaurant group interested in the location. I nodded, genuinely unbothered by the news. I hope he gets a fair price. The friend studied me with curious eyes. You really don't care anymore, do you? I care about myself, I replied. That's the difference. A week before the grand opening of Emma's Inheritance, Elaine, Daniel's mother, appeared at my door. The last time I'd seen her, she had been accepting keys to a luxury car from her son. Now she stood on my porch, tension evident in the rigid set of her shoulders. I returned the car, she said without preamble. When Daniel finally told me the truth about your investment, about everything you did for the cafe, I couldn't keep it. I gestured for her to come inside, my hospitality automatic despite our strained relationship. In my kitchen, surrounded by recipe books and testing notes for my new bakery, I offered her tea that she accepted with trembling hands. I didn't know, she continued, her eyes fixed on the steaming cup. He never told me where the startup money came from. He let me believe. She trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between us. You believed what he wanted you to believe. I finished for her. We all did for a time. He's lost everything, she said, a mother's worry etched in the lines of her face. The cafe, your marriage, his confidence. He's staying with us now, hardly leaves his room. I absorbed this information without the surge of vindication I might have expected weeks ago. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of sadness for what might have been and relief for what would never be again. Daniel will rebuild his life, I said with certainty. He's resourceful and talented. But this time, he'll have to do it honestly, without someone else's invisible support. She nodded slowly, understanding the gentle finality in my words. As she rose to leave, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the marble countertop. Your bakery, she said, gesturing to the recipe notes spread across the island. When does it open? Next Saturday, I replied. You're welcome to come. Her smile was sad but genuine. Maybe I will. The grand opening of Emma's Inheritance exceeded all my expectations. A line formed before dawn, curious locals drawn by the tantalizing aromas and advanced press coverage that focused, unabashedly, on me as the sole owner and visionary. Former regulars from Crumb and Kettle came too, many expressing relief at finding me again. We knew something was off when you disappeared from the cafe, one elderly woman confided as she sampled my cardamom-spiced Finnish pulla bread. It never felt the same without you there. By mid-afternoon, we had sold out of nearly everything. My small but dedicated staff, hired with care and compensated fairly, their contributions openly acknowledged, moved through the space with the joyful energy of people who feel valued. As closing time approached, I stepped outside to breathe in the unseasonably warm autumn air, savoring a moment of quiet pride in what I'd created. Across the street, a familiar figure caught my attention. Daniel, standing half hidden in the shadow of a maple tree, watching the success of my new venture with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met briefly across the distance. He raised a hand in a gesture that might have been congratulatory, might have been farewell. I acknowledged him with a slight nod, neither welcoming nor dismissing. Then I turned and walked back into my bakery, closing the door gently behind me. That evening, as I tallied receipts and planned the next day's baking schedule, I realized something profound. I had regained not just my voice and visibility, but my sense of self-worth. The woman who had once poured her inheritance into someone else's dream now understood her own value too well to ever become invisible again. The next day, I updated the bakery's website with a new tradition. Emma's Inheritance will be closed on October 15th each year to celebrate the owner's birthday. And as the years passed, I held true to that promise. Each birthday, I closed early and spent the day surrounded by people who truly saw me, friends who valued my success, staff who appreciated my leadership, customers who knew my name and story. Sometimes, in quiet moments of reflection, I would think about Daniel and the lessons we both learned from our unraveling. I hoped he found his way to authenticity, to a success built on truth rather than convenient erasure. But those thoughts grew less frequent as my own life expanded with genuine achievement and joy. The betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable had ultimately freed me. By forgetting my birthday, but remembering to thank his mother with a car I had indirectly paid for, Daniel had inadvertently given me the most valuable gift of all: the courage to claim my own life, my own success, and most importantly, my own name.